No one ever tells you that the hardest part of raising a child alone is not the exhaustion, not the unfinished dinners, not the school events where you sit there as the only parent by yourself. The hardest part is the hope. My name is Thomas Harland. I am a construction contractor in Knoxville with hands that never seem to wash the cement dust away. I spent my whole life building houses for other people. I understand strength. I understand foundations. But the structure I poured the most of my blood and bone into was the back porch of my own home. Every plank I nailed down carried my absolute belief in the future. I imagined quiet afternoons sitting there with Patricia watching Garrett run across the grass. But life is not a finished blueprint. Patricia, my wife, died when Garrett had just turned 11. Cancer. It came like a tornado without warning and wiped away every plan we had made. At the funeral, the image that haunted me the most was not the cold coffin. It was Garrett. The boy was wearing one of my white shirts far too big for him. His small shoulders were drowning inside the loose fabric the same way he was drowning in a grief far too heavy for a child his age. I stood there looking at my son and felt something crack deep inside my own soul. That day I made myself a promise. I would be the scaffolding for that boy. I would be the pillar he could lean on. I nailed my pain shut, the way a man drives nails into hardwood. No gaps. No space for weakness. I believed that if I stayed strong enough, Garrett would grow up with a smooth road ahead of him. I held on to that hope for many long years. I believed that after the storm the sky would clear. I believed the structure of my life was finally close to completion as I watched Garrett become a man. But I was wrong. Hope is a double-edged weapon. It makes you blind to the cracks forming inside the heart of the child you love the most. I was so busy building Garrett's future that I never noticed the moral foundation inside him slowly eroding under the weight of selfishness. I never imagined that the very hope I had carefully protected all those years would one day tighten around my throat, because at the exact moment I believed I could finally rest, a message arrived from the hospital. It was not simply good news. It was the beginning of a betrayal that no father could ever prepare himself to face. So let me tell you what happened next. It all began on a Tuesday. I had to learn how to do everything. A man with rough fingers, hands that had only ever known hammers and saws, suddenly had to learn how to hold a baseball the right way so he could teach his son. I learned how to tell the difference between healthy breakfast cereals. I even learned how to sit quietly beside Garrett in a counseling room every Thursday afternoon. For 15 years we were like two lonely beams trying to hold up a roof that had lost its shelter when Patricia was gone. I built my son the same way I build a house. Strong. Straight. No flaws. When Garrett graduated from college, when he met Stacy and married her, I finally breathed out. I stood on the familiar back porch watching the sunset and whispered to Patricia that we had done it. My job was finished. Then that day came. Garrett walked up to me with a strange brightness on his face. He grabbed my shoulders, his voice shaking with excitement. "Dad, Stacy is pregnant. You're going to be a grandfather." In that moment I felt electricity run down my spine. A new life. A new branch connected again to Patricia, to me, and to the future of the Harland family. I pulled him into a tight embrace, feeling the heartbeat of the man I had shaped with my own hands. I believed this was the final brick, the perfect piece to fill the empty space in my heart that had been there for 15 long years. Welcome back to Dad's Real Life Revenge. Where are you watching this video from? And what time is it where you are right now? Leave a comment below. I read every single one of them. That joy lasted 8 months. I built a small oak cradle with my own hands. I repainted the attic room the soft blue color of the Knoxville spring sky. I calculated everything. I designed a perfect plan for my retirement years with my granddaughter. But life always finds the cracks in even the strongest walls. When the phone rang at 2 in the morning, I had no idea that sound was the alarm for a complete collapse. Lily was born 6 weeks early, and when I rushed to the hospital and looked through the glass of the incubator, I saw a tiny life that weighed only 4 pounds and 11 ounces. The baby looked far too small for the storms that were coming. And once again I found myself standing in front of a structure that was shaking from its very foundation with no blueprint showing how to save it. What I didn't know then was that at the very moment this child needed support, the most the two people she would call her parents were already quietly packing their bags to walk away. Now let me tell you what happened next. That fateful conversation took place on a Tuesday. Hospitals always have a particular smell. a mixture of harsh disinfectant and concentrated fear. Lily lay there among wires and tubes looking like a baby bird that had fallen out of its nest before its wings had time to grow. 4 pounds and 11 ounces. That number kept circling in my mind. It was so lighter than the bag of 10-inch nails I usually carry on my tool belt. Garrett and Stacy, his wife, stood beside me, but they were strangely quiet. At first I thought it was the shock of new parents. Then the doctor asked us to step into a consultation room. The diagnosis hit like a hammer straight to the forehead. Severe hearing loss. Lily could not hear anything. Her world was complete silence. I looked at my son, hoping to see determination in his eyes. My mind had already started working. I thought about the best doctors' early intervention programs, and how I could turn my house into a safe place for a child who could not hear sound. To me, this was not a tragedy. It was simply a tougher construction site. If a foundation sinks, you reinforce it. You do not tear the whole house down. "We will be all right," I said quietly, trying to steady the two of them. "It is just a harder road. I will help." But Stacy did not look at me. She stared out the window with empty eyes. And Garrett, he had his fingers locked together, a habit from childhood whenever he wanted to escape something. The air in that room was not grief. It was denial slowly burning under the surface. For the next week, I barely slept. I stayed up studying everything I could find. Cochlear implants, sign language, how a child's brain grows in silence. I wanted to build the strongest scaffolding possible for Lily before she even realized she was different. But while I was busy drawing blueprints for my granddaughter's future, the main architect of her life, her own father, was quietly preparing a permanent stop work order. Let me tell you what happened next. That conversation took place on a Tuesday. Garrett stood in front of me, breathing fast. He was not holding Lily's medical file. He was holding a stack of legal papers. The title across the top made the blood in my body feel like ice. Voluntary termination of parental rights. He looked straight into my eyes, the same eyes I had spent 15 years teaching about responsibility, and he said the words that shattered my entire world. Garrett stood there in the living room of the house I had poured my sweat into building. The paper in his hand was trembling, but his voice was cold in a way that felt almost cruel. He placed the stack of documents titled Voluntary Termination of Parental Rights on the oak table right beside my cup of coffee that was still steaming. "You don't understand," Dad, Garrett said, his voice rising like an architect explaining why a flawed structure has to be torn down. "We're still young. We can't spend our whole lives taking care of a child. A broken child. Stacy can't handle that. And neither can I." I looked at my son, the same boy who once wore my oversized white shirt at his mother's funeral. I searched for even a shadow of the kid who used to cry when he saw an injured sparrow. But the man standing in front of me was a stranger. A man trying to sweep his own flesh and blood aside like scrap metal on a construction site. "She is your daughter, Garrett," I said quietly, my voice thick like wet cement. "She's your blood. Her name is Lily." Garrett stared straight into my eyes. There was no guilt there, only irritation that I refused to understand. "Find someone else to care," he snapped. "This isn't your battle, old man. Stop trying to play the hero at your age." Then the door slammed. The sound echoed through the house like an explosion, marking the collapse of the foundation I had spent 15 years building. I sat there as darkness slowly settled over Knoxville, my hands locked together. 22 minutes. I counted every tick of the clock. 22 minutes of complete silence before I finally understood something. The son I loved had died the moment he made that choice. If you are still listening to this story, I need you to do something before we go any further. Hit the subscribe button and leave a like on this video. Those small actions are the greatest support for people who are still fighting for what is right. I stood up. The joints of a 62-year-old man cracked dryly. I walked into the bedroom and pulled out the old box of Patricia's keepsakes from under the bed. I thought about what she would say if she were standing here. She would not cry. She would look at me and say, "Thomas, that child didn't ask to be born into a family that would abandon her. If the foundation is broken, then we dig a new one ourselves." The next morning, I did not go to the construction site. I went to a lawyer's office. The next 9 months became a journey I never imagined I would have to take again at my age. Financial evaluations. Hours of psychological testing. Social workers inspecting every corner of my house to decide whether an old construction contractor could raise a deaf child. They looked at my rough, scarred hands with doubt. They asked me about scaffolding. Not construction scaffolding, but emotional support systems for a disabled child. I answered them in the language of a builder. If you want to build a skyscraper on weak soil, you need the deepest and strongest pillars. I am that pillar. I started learning American Sign Language. Every night after Lily fell asleep in the small oak cradle I built, I sat under a yellow lamp, trying to shape my rough fingers into the soft forms of language. Hands that were used to holding a hammer now struggled to form words. Sometimes the cramps made my fingers ache sharply, but I never stopped, because I knew that every sign I learned was another brick in the bridge, connecting Lily's silent world to my heart. But life always seems to test the patience of people who build things. Just when I believed I had everything under control, another document appeared on my table. This time it did not come from Garrett. It came from Child Protective Services, and it was an unannounced investigation request that could take away everything I had been fighting to protect. Time is a patient builder. It wears down the sharp edges of pain and slowly covers them with the quiet moss of calm. 7 years passed. The house in Knoxville was no longer silent, though it remained peaceful in its own special way. It was filled with the sounds of running footsteps and little hands dancing through the air. Lily had grown into a 7-year-old girl as bright as a sunflower. The most miraculous moment of my life was not the day I finished a skyscraper, but the day Lily put on her new hearing device and heard me call her name for the first time. Her eyes widened. Then a smile spread across her face like the first light of dawn. In that moment I understood that every callus on my hands, every sleepless night spent learning sign language had been worth it. I built Lily a memory wall in the middle of the living room. Not with bricks or stone, but with hundreds of photographs. Lily taking her first steps. Lily inside a bookstore. Lily signing, "I love you, Grandpa," with her tiny hands. It was proof of a happy life built from the ruins of abandonment. Then one Saturday afternoon that peaceful blueprint was suddenly torn apart. A shiny car pulled into the driveway. Garrett stepped out. He looked older. The arrogance he once carried had been replaced by a visible nervousness. He stood there staring at the porch. I still swept every morning, staring at the daughter he once called defective now, sitting in the yard reading a book. He walked into the house, his breath heavy with regret. When he saw the wall filled with Lily's photographs, he stopped. His shoulders trembled. He touched one of the pictures and whispered hoarsely, "Dad, I didn't know. I didn't think she could become like this." I stood with my arms crossed, leaning against the solid oak doorframe. I did not feel anger. That fire had burned out long ago. All that remained was emptiness for a man who had deserted his own battlefield. "Dad," Garrett said again, turning around with red eyes. "Stacy and I, we were wrong. We want to fix things. We want to come back into Lily's life. We are her parents. That can't ever change." "Right," I looked at my son. Then I looked outside where Lily was running toward us, holding a wildflower in her hand. She looked at Garrett with the curious eyes she might give any stranger. Nothing more. I took a deep breath, smelling warm wood and sunlight. Then I spoke with the voice of a final judgment. "Garrett, in construction, when you sign the document that transfers a project away and abandon responsibility because you think it isn't worth anything, you don't get to come back later when you see it has become a masterpiece." Garrett opened his mouth to interrupt, but I raised my rough hand. "That decision is not mine anymore. It belongs to Lily." I looked at Garrett, the man collapsing in front of me, and realized something. The most painful revenge is not punishment. It is letting someone see exactly what they chose to lose. Lily handed the flower to me, then signed with her small hands. "Who is he, Grandpa?" I stayed silent for a long moment, feeling the weight of the truth about to be spoken. I looked into Lily's clear, innocent eyes, then over at Garrett's face as it slowly fell apart. My hands, the same hands that had built hundreds of roofs, were now holding a truth heavier than any stone. I signed slowly and clearly so Lily could understand. "This is an old acquaintance of mine, sweetheart. Someone who once lost his way." Lily nodded politely, offering a small but distant smile. Then she skipped back toward the flower beds. She had no idea who that man really was. And the truth was, she did not need to know. Because in Lily's world, the word father was not defined by blood written on paper. It belonged to the person who stayed up night after night, learning every sign just to speak with her. Garrett stood there in silence. He understood that the door to Lily's life had not been locked by me. He had built that wall himself 7 years ago. Lily had never been a broken child. The only thing that had been broken was Garrett's judgment. He saw a disability. I saw a soul that needed protection. He saw a burden. I saw the greatest project a man could ever build before closing his eyes for the last time. Life is a lot like building a house in the middle of a storm. You cannot stop the storm from coming. All you can do is choose to build the foundation strong enough to survive it. Love is not the promises people make when the sky is clear. Love is showing up and continuing to show up, even when the floorboards are shaking the hardest. I sat down again on the porch I had built with my own hands. The Knoxville sunset painted the calluses on my palms with warm gold light. I did not feel tired anymore. I did not feel anger anymore. All I felt was a quiet kind of peace. I had finished Patricia's blueprint. I had held the pillar steady for Lily. If this story touched something deep inside your heart, I ask you to do 2 things. Subscribe to the channel and press the like button. The people who find these stories and stay until the very end are the ones who truly understand what it means to love something greater than themselves. Thank you for being part of Dad's real-life revenge. I watched Garrett's figure slowly disappear beyond the trees. The world can be silent, but love always has its own voice, a language that does not need sound. Only hands willing to hold on to each other and never let go. And under this porch, everything had finally settled into place. A completed structure. A peaceful heart. Learning a new language at the age of 62 is like trying to bend a rusted steel bar. My hands, rough and thick, knuckled from 40 years of gripping hammers and hoists, now had to perform delicate movements I had never imagined before. Every night after Lily had fallen asleep in the oak cradle, I sat under the dim yellow light in the living room. In front of me there were no blueprints or material invoices anymore. There was an American Sign Language dictionary. I stared at the illustrations and tried to copy them. Imagine a contractor who has spent his entire life breaking and building things with brute strength, suddenly trying to sign the word love. My thumb and index finger would stiffen like frozen nails. Some nights the cramps were so bad my hands twisted with pain and I had to soak them in warm water just to relax the muscles. There were nights I threw the book onto the floor, frustration rising in my throat. I would mutter to myself, "Thomas, you are an old bricklayer. What in the world are you doing?" But then I would look at the hearing device resting on the table. I would listen to the absolute silence filling the house. And I would remember that quitting was not an option. In construction, we have a concept called scaffolding. Scaffolding is not the house itself, but without it you can never build high walls. I realized these hand signs were the scaffolding I was building for Lily. If I could not learn to speak with my hands, she would remain trapped forever in a dark basement without the light of communication. So I started with the most basic words: milk, sleep, grandpa. I stood in front of the mirror and repeated them hundreds of times until the movements became smooth. I even learned how to use my eyes and facial expressions to show emotion, something a quiet southern man like me had never been comfortable doing. But life never lets you finish a structure without harsh inspections. That Monday morning, while I was awkwardly practicing the sign for family, there was a knock at the door. It was not Garrett. It was a woman in a gray suit holding a clipboard, wearing the serious expression of a Child Protective Services officer. She had come to evaluate whether a solitary old man with scarred hands could truly provide the best home for a deaf child. Her eyes moved from the calluses on my hands to the ASL book lying open on the table. The doubt in her expression was clear. A small gap in the legal paperwork, an unsatisfactory answer about long-term finances, or simply prejudice about my age. Any of those things could give them the reason to take Lily away from me. If you are still here, if you understand the heart of a man fighting to keep the only family he has left, take a moment to subscribe and leave a like. People who value perseverance like you help keep stories like this alive. I invited her to sit down and poured her a cup of tea with hands that were still trembling from hours of practice. I knew this was no longer about learning a language. This was a life or death inspection for the foundation I was trying so hard to protect. The woman from Child Protective Services looked at me the way someone looks at an old building that is about to be demolished. She asked about education funds, specialized programs, and why I believed a man in the later years of his life could possibly keep up with the development of a child who could not hear. I did not answer her with dry numbers. Instead, I stood up, walked over to the cradle, and gently lifted Lily, who was still half asleep. I looked straight into the woman's eyes and began signing the words I had practiced until the skin on my fingers had nearly split. I did not speak with my hands alone. I spoke with my heart. She fell silent. The suspicion in her eyes slowly softened, replaced by a quiet respect. When she finally left and placed the approval document on the table, I knew I had just passed the greatest load test of my life. The 7 years that followed were a long chapter of perseverance. Lily did not simply grow. She burst into life like a green shoot pushing through dry concrete. The moment came one autumn afternoon when Lily turned 4 years old. I had just fitted her with the newest digital hearing device, the result of working double shifts at construction sites for months. We were sitting across from each other on the familiar porch. My breathing felt heavy with anticipation. I tapped lightly on the wooden table. Lily flinched. Her eyes widened with pure surprise. I cleared my throat, trying to keep my voice steady, and whispered, "Lily." She turned instantly, her gaze locked onto mine. For the first time in her life, Lily was not looking at my hands for signs. She was looking at my lips, watching the vibrations of the air around us. Then a smile appeared on her face, brighter than any construction floodlight I had ever installed. She tried to speak. The sound was imperfect, fragile, but it was enough to stop my heart. "Grand-pa." That was the moment I knew I had won. I had built a bridge between two worlds. By the time Lily turned 7, she had grown into a confident, intelligent girl full of life. She could move effortlessly between American Sign Language and expressive body language, communicating ideas that even people with perfect hearing sometimes struggled to express. Lily was living proof of one simple truth. Nothing is truly broken if the builder is patient enough to repair it. But just when I began enjoying the quiet shade of the life I had built, a ghost from the past appeared again. Garrett. The son who had abandoned this battle 7 years earlier was now standing at the gate. He was no longer the arrogant young man he once was. But his return carried something dangerous, a late sense of possession. He saw Lily laughing in the yard, and in his eyes I caught a hunger that made my chest tighten. Garrett stepped inside, his eyes fixed on the memory wall, filled with Lily's photographs. His hand trembled as he reached toward one of them. But I stepped forward and stood between him and the history he had never helped build. "She is my daughter," Dad, Garrett whispered, his voice thick with self-deception. "I have the right." I let out a dry laugh, a sound as rough as sand sliding across stone. "Rights only come with responsibility, Garrett. You chose to walk away when this wall was about to collapse. Now that it stands strong, you don't get to come back and claim ownership just because it looks beautiful." Garrett stood frozen in front of the wall in the living room. The oak frames I had built with my own hands stretched across it like a slow-moving film of the 7 years he had missed. There was a picture of Lily taking her first steps with her hearing brace, another of her receiving an art award at school, one more of the two of us covered in mud after a long day working in the garden. Every photograph was a brick, and every brick was a promise I had kept. "Dad, I didn't know. I never thought she could grow like this," Garrett whispered. His hands, once obsessively clean, trembled as they touched the glass of the frame. I stood with my arms folded, the broad shoulders of an old contractor casting a steady shadow over him. I felt no anger. Time and too many sleepless nights raising Lily had worn that anger away long ago. Looking at Garrett now, I saw only a stranger trying to reclaim something he had once thrown into the trash. "You didn't know because you chose not to know," I said quietly, my voice calm in a way that almost sounded frightening. "On that Tuesday, when you placed those termination papers on my table, you signed the death sentence of your role as a father." Garrett turned toward me, his eyes red. Whether from regret or wounded pride, I could not tell. "Dad, Stacy and we were wrong," he said. "Our lives are stable now. We want Lily to have a real family. You're getting older. You can't take care of her forever." I stepped closer until I was standing face to face with him. "A real family is not defined by how many parents appear on a document," I said. "It is defined by who stays when everyone else walks away. When Lily was sick, I was there. When she learned her first sign, I was there. When she cried because she couldn't hear anything, these rough hands were the ones holding her." Then I looked straight into his eyes. "Where were you, Garrett?" Lowered his head. But like a man losing an argument who still grabs at the last piece of straw, he looked up again. "But I'm her father. That blood can't be replaced. I let out a dry laugh without a trace of warmth. Blood gives you a beginning. Sacrifice is what makes someone a father. You want to come back. You want to fix things. I pointed toward the window. Outside, Lily sat on the porch happily reading a comic book in the quiet world I had built for her. That decision isn't mine anymore. It belongs to Lily. Then I added slowly, but remember this. Don't confuse your regret with love. You regret it because you see how well she turned out, not because you cared about that 4-pound 11-ounce baby lying in an incubator. The people who find stories like this and stay until the very end understand better than anyone what it means to love something greater than themselves. Thank you for being here with Dad's real-life revenge. Garrett took a step toward the door as if he wanted to walk outside and call Lily, but I placed my heavy hand on his shoulder. Don't, I said quietly. Don't disturb her peaceful world with your selfishness one more time. Garrett stood silently beneath the shade of the porch. He looked at Lily, then down at his own smooth hands, without a single callus, and finally at my cracked hands, still carrying the smell of lime and cement. The silence stretched on like a century. In that moment he understood something. Some blueprints once torn apart can never be restored to their original form. He turned and walked away. The sound of his car engine slowly faded until it disappeared down the road leading out of Knoxville. I did not feel triumph. I only felt the last heavy weight finally lift from my shoulders. I stepped out onto the porch and sat beside Lily. She looked up at me and signed with her small hands. Did that man leave, Grandpa? I smiled and gently held her hand, signing back. Yes. He went to find his own road. And us. We are right here. Lily was never a damaged child. The only thing that had ever been damaged was Garrett's judgment and the prejudice of people who only see limitations but never see potential. In construction, when you see a crack in a structure, you have two choices. You can ignore it and watch the building collapse, or you can reinforce it until it becomes the strongest support of the entire structure. I chose the second path, and the result was right beside me. A confident 7-year-old girl, strong and full of life, who does not need perfect hearing to understand the rhythm of love. The greatest lesson I learned at the age of 62 was not written in any engineering manual. It is this: love is not a noun. Love is a verb. Love is showing up and continuing to show up. It is not the emotion you feel when everything is easy. It is the decision to stay when the storm arrives and tears the roof from above your head. Never abandon someone simply because they do not match the perfect blueprint in your mind. The greatest structures are often built on the most difficult ground. If you ever stand at a crossroads between the easy path of walking away or the harder road of fighting for someone you love, remember Lily. Remember that the sacrifice you make today becomes the foundation of their happiness tomorrow. I took a deep breath, smelling oak wood and the warm sunlight of the late afternoon. Somewhere Patricia was surely smiling. I had not let my scaffolding collapse. I had kept my promise. If this story touched something deep in your heart, please do 2 things. Subscribe to the channel and press the like button. The people who find these stories and stay until the very end are the ones who truly understand what it means to love something greater than themselves. Thank you for staying with Dad's real-life revenge until these final moments. The world may be full of noise, but in the quiet of this home we hear each other more clearly than ever. Love, when built on honesty and perseverance, is a structure that will always endure. Everything had finally become peaceful. A finished structure. A heart that had finally found its place of rest.